Good afternoon, everyone. It's time for the program to begin. I hope you've all enjoyed your lunch. My name is Anita Volz-Ween, and I have the pleasure of introducing Laura Tyson, class of 1969, a distinguished economist, educator, writer, and corporate board member. First, though, I would like to thank Carol Christ and the college for this fabulous program that is underway. I personally have been very moved and invigorated by all of the speeches that I've heard, and I hope you share my enthusiasm for the weekend. Laura is the S.K. and Angela Chan Professor of Global Management at the University of California at Berkeley. She is a former trustee who has made her mark in academia, government, and the private sector, one of a small number of women who have had an impact in all three arenas, and we are very proud of her. She has moved seamlessly from one area to the other and is widely respected for her expertise in economics and her management skills. Laura epitomizes Smith's concept of leadership, and we are delighted to welcome her today as our keynote speaker at lunch. She personifies both a woman of the world and a leader in public service, the dual themes of this celebratory weekend. Laura's career has taken her to Washington, where in 1993 she served in the Clinton administration in the prestigious role of chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, the first woman to hold that position, and subsequently was the president's influential national economic advisor. Currently, she is involved in Washington as a member of President Obama's Council of Jobs and Competitiveness, and also of Hillary Clinton's Foreign Affairs Policy Board. At our table at lunch, we decided we want Laura to go back to Washington. She has wonderful ideas on how to solve some of the country's problems. In 2002, not having spent her junior year abroad, which I confirmed with Laura last night, she decided she needed more international exposure, and she accepted a job as Dean of the London Business School, which broadened her understanding of global economics and business, having previously held the position of Dean of the Berkeley Haas School of Business. An experienced corporate board director, Laura serves on the boards of a number of well-known public companies, including Morgan Stanley and AT&T, and on many advisory boards ranging from Newman's Own to Samsung to Pete Peterson's Institute of International Economics. She's also on my firm's advisory board. Everyone seems to want a piece of Laura, and I have it on good authority how effective she is when it comes to difficult issues that are brought to the attention of the board that have to be resolved. Laura returned to campus last fall to deliver the keynote address on the 10th anniversary of the launching of the Women's Financial Independence Program, an initiative that grew out of remarks that Laura made when she was a trustee of the college, and her belief that Smith's students should develop a sense of financial literacy while they were on campus to prepare them for the use of credit card management for investments and personal financial planning. The program is flourishing, and I've learned that we have a Women's Financial Independence Center, we now have a global financial institutions concentration. We have a vibrant program of brown bag lunches where professors from the economics department speak with the students, and it's become a very, very popular program on campus. And for this, we thank you, Laura, because your idea has been so helpful to so many generations of students now. Anyone who heard Laura speak at the time of the 10th anniversary celebration knows how much her students must love having her as a professor, because she's a wonderful speaker. She's also the author of books and articles on industrial competitiveness and trade, and a contributor to the active debate on economic issues. Laura wrote recently that there are deficits other than the fiscal deficit that we have to be concerned about: a jobs deficit, an investment deficit, and an education deficit. That is not the topic that Laura has chosen for today, but perhaps there will be some time to discuss those issues as well. Moving to today's topic, the professional opportunities for women are significantly greater today than when Laura graduated from Smith, but we all know that there are many barriers around the world to women's success. As a senior advisor at the McKinsey Global Institute and being involved with the World Economic Forum, Laura is also co-chair of the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on Women's Empowerment. In that connection, she will be speaking to us today about the global gender gap, an index introduced by the World Economic Forum in 2006 to capture the magnitude and scope of gender-based disparities and track their progress. We look forward to her comments, and we hope that her voice will continue to resonate in policy circles for many years to come. Laura?
Thank you very, very much. People always say, but I'm going to say it with passion and meaning. That was just a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much, Anita. And I want to say, I actually am proud, very proud, of the fact that while I was only a member of the Board of Trustees for a short time, that one of the pieces of advice that I gave actually has led to this wonderful center at Smith College. So when I look back at my roles in life, I try to see what has lasted, what has been built upon, and I actually think this center is one of my lasting contributions in terms of just thinking about it. So thank you to the college and all of its supporters for making it happen, because an idea is an idea that needs to be executed and funded, and the college has done that. Let me also just start with my own reflections of my life at Smith. You know, earlier this year, a very important professor in my life at Smith died much too young. One of the major professors in the economics department for decades, Fred Leonard. And I was completely moved by the fact that he asked his son to talk about me in his obituary, because he wanted to talk about, not me personally, but me as an example of what his passion for economics at Smith, his passion for the success of women going forward from Smith, his helping give women confidence, ambition, aspiration, motivation, and there are many, many, many Smith professors like that. I just happened, for me, when I was here, he was critically important, and I just want to note that what I got here through him, I'm sure generations of Smith students also got from him, but from all of the other wonderful faculty at Smith. So since I have spent my years mostly as a faculty member, I just wanted to start with that. Thank you to all of the outstanding faculty at Smith who are not just outstanding in their research, but are committed to their teaching and committed deeply to their students. Very, very important. Now when I left Smith, with Fred's support to try MIT, which I thought was probably going to be economics as an entirely different discipline, and it was pretty scary. But when I left Smith, I wasn't like Jane Harmon. Some of you probably heard her yesterday. She knew in high school she wanted to do politics. She wanted to, be a student leader. She wanted to be a campaign organizer. She wanted to be a political leader. When I left Smith, I wanted to be a PhD in economics, and I wanted to be a professor. But I had policy interests all the time. So I always had this kind of, I wasn't into the high theory for theory's sake. My discipline tends to divide that way, high theory for theory's sake and applied problems. I always knew that I was interested in applied problems. So policy became more and more interesting to me over my years as assistant professor. And I'm not going to dwell on this other than to say that's dangerous for assistant professors, because assistant professors are supposed to be publishing articles and teaching their class and not wasting a lot of time on policy issues. So I did it a little bit at a time. And the reason I tell this story is to get to the World Economic Forum, I have to tell the story of how I ended up getting from a PhD in economics at MIT, which a couple of times I considered dropping from. But this is, again, another important point about faculty and mentorship and faculty and sponsorship. Faculty both at Smith and then at MIT, when I had some, oh, can I do this? Do I really want to do this? This is too hard. I can't possibly succeed. Basically said, yes, you can. Yes, you must. Yes, you should. All of those things, aspiration. In any event, when I became an assistant professor, I started to do more and more policy. And that really was the way I ultimately, through a series of networks and conferences and writing that I had done, ended up being asked to join the Council of Economic Advisors. So in any kind of pathway story here, it starts with education and it starts with Smith. And it goes through MIT, but then it goes through getting engaged in things you're passionate about and using your expertise, your content expertise, your legal degree, your business degree, your econ degree, to try to solve the problems you're passionate about solving. Fast forward now to essentially the early 1990s, before I went to government. So there is this amazing organization that's taking shape called the World Economic Forum. At that time, it was actually pretty small. It had started, so just so you kind of understand the genesis here, a professor of business from Switzerland, bringing together a relatively small number of CEOs, that means at that time all men, to talk about business problems and economic problems in Europe. That's how it started. But they decided early on that they should bring in academics to provide some of the content. So I was brought in to provide some of the content because I was working on trade and competitiveness, and I was considered to be someone who was rising in that field. So I ended up being a faculty advisor to the World Economic Forum. And at that time, as I said, there were no gender issues discussed. There were virtually no women in either any rooms or on the podium or in the audience. But I thought it was a really interesting and important organization of potential. I then became, when I went to government, I was invited as a government official to attend the World Economic Forum. And I attended the World Economic Forum for 3 years as a government official. Now, just to show you how the state of gender issues at the World Economic Forum at that time, my husband joined me once. He said he would never join me again. That's one of the moments we closest came to I won't say divorce, but let's say separation, all right? He is given a bag with flowers on it. And I am given the serious bag. He is told he can't go to any sessions, but he can go on a sleigh ride through town. He was probably one of like 10 male partners. That's the situation. So all the rest of the partners were females, and they got the flowered bag and the sleigh ride, just like any. I tell that story because the World Economic Forum, through a small number of women, including, by the way, and this occurred to me last night when I heard the stories last night, including the daughter of the founder of the World Economic Forum. Daughters and fathers are very important in many, many stories of change in organizations. The daughter and the small number of women there started to talk about, hey, you know, we're talking about competitiveness. You guys are doing a global competitiveness indicator. You're ranking countries on how competitive they are. You're talking about the importance of talent. Gender's never mentioned. Gender's never there. Half the talent or half the potential talent pool or women, let's start talking about gender. So over the course of the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, there was just a growing movement. The World Economic Forum prides itself on measurement. It prides itself on saying, let's figure out what determines how competitive a country is, what determines its living standards, what determines its trade positions. I got all kinds of indicators and diagrams and graphs, and as I said, nothing in the indicators about gender. So a number of us decided that we would encourage the creation of a new gender gap index so that countries could see how are we doing on the issue of the problem we set for ourselves, or how are we doing on the issue of gender parity or gender equity in key areas of our society: health, education, economic advancement, and political representation. We chose 4. And we said it's important for societies to get a sense of how they're doing here vis-a-vis how they're doing on the global competitiveness indicator and how they're doing vis-a-vis one another. I want to say an amazing little fact that I shared with the table. The person inside that I have worked with most closely on this, who really is the originator of much of the effort here, another outstanding young woman from Pakistan. Okay, Sadia Zahidi. She recruited me and another academic from Harvard to actually help put together the index. It's very carefully compiled. It's statistically as rigorous as you can possibly be. She has led the effort to publish the report year after year. We now have regional meetings around the world. It's now got a lot of press. And by the way, now a lot of countries who have ministers of, there are lots of countries now that have ministries of culture that deal with women's issues, ministries of, for women that deal with women's issues. And so countries around the world are kind of looking at how they're doing on this and talking about it. It's influencing policy gradually. So I feel very proud of it as an accomplishment. But I really want to note that it was an accomplishment of the forum and of leadership within the forum. Now, let me talk a little bit about the index itself, because I think it's really interesting to see what we have found out. First of all, what were the goals? What were the goals of setting this up? One was to track the size and the direction, improvement, deterioration, in gender inequalities in certain areas. And I mentioned the 4 areas already. The second goal was opportunities for countries to learn about where they are, but also to learn from one another. So now we have these regional meetings, or these meetings each year in Davos at the World Economic Forum, where business and political leaders come together and actually share best practices in terms of what they might have done in the health arena or the education arena or the equal pay arena to try to improve things. So we have learning from one another. And then I would say at the broadest level, it's fostering awareness. So if you actually see that you're doing poorly as a country in a certain area, it might foster awareness among your voters or your citizens or your other cabinet officials to do something. So some of the principal features, and by the way, I don't want to go into too much detail. You can go onto the World Economic Forum website and read the report, and it's got wonderful graphs and charts. But just to point out some things. First of all, we were interested in measuring gaps to equality. So that means that you can be a poor country and have relatively low levels, say, of educational opportunity for all your citizens, but you could have a small gap. Okay, so basically you're poor as a country, so the educational opportunities or health opportunities you offer your citizens are not going to be as generous as those that are offered, say, in Norway. But you may actually be, in the way you deliver them, not have a large amount of inequity. And so we were looking at this issue of inequity or inequality, not at the overall level. So it turns out that there are poor countries like the Philippines, like Cuba, there are middle-income countries like South Africa, that do quite well on this index, even though you might go in as an NGO or you might go in as for government service and see that the overall level is really still a problem. Second thing is we looked at outcomes, not enabling factors. We decided that we couldn't possibly measure all of the things that go into whether health outcomes are looked to be equitably delivered. We can't go into size of hospital, number of doctors, it's just too much. We can start with the outcome, and then somebody else can go and look at the enabling factors. The third is we were constrained by data, and this is important vis-a-vis what we were talking about last night. Constrained by data. We had to find data for a large number of countries that data had to be roughly comparable. So we have 135 countries, that's 90% of the world's population. But that means that, for example, in the area of political representation, we can't measure differences among countries, say at the mayoral level, or at the community level, or at the village level. There's just no international data set there. We can measure differences among countries in political representation in terms of share of women in parliament, share of women holding ministerial positions, share of women who hold an executive position in a certain 5-year period. But we can't measure things like mayoral representation. So we are constrained by the data. In the area of economic opportunity, we measure, there are data which allow you to look at male-female earnings differentials. But everybody knows that male-female earnings differentials have a distortion in them because men and women in societies do different things. Even in the most advanced societies, they do different things, and those different things have different earnings associated with them. So our earnings differential number mixes occupational and sectoral differences with equity issues. And we know that, and that's just the way it is. But those are some of the concerns. So each country gets measured on 4 of these 4 indices. By the way, the education, so let me say a little bit more about each of these. On health, we're looking at the healthy life expectancy of women versus men, and we're looking at the sex ratio at birth. And that's because, as everyone knows, in societies, because of the way attitudes toward male versus female children, sometimes the sex ratio at birth is misreported. Sometimes births which should have occurred of a female child don't occur at all. So we wanted to look at sex ratio at birth. Educational attainment, pretty easy to measure at every level. Literacy rates for men and women, primary enrollment, secondary enrollment, tertiary enrollment. Participation, economic participation. You got labor force participation, but again, that one you're mixing women who are in the labor force because they have to be, and women who are in the labor force because they want to be, and that is a big issue. Anytime you see country comparisons on labor force participation, just ask yourself that question: which is which? I already talked about the problem of remuneration and the differences in earnings, and then we have a gap on advancement of men and women, and we sort of look at that in terms of percentage of women who reach senior official manager levels in their organizations, or the percentage of women who are classified as technical and professional workers. So we have 2 different variables. And then I already mentioned the political empowerment one. By the way, one of the reasons the US is not close in the top 10 in the list overall is because we've never had a woman president. If we had a woman president in the last 5 years, we would have catapulted to the top. And that's not a political statement, that's a data statement, okay? That's simply a data statement. Right. So let me just give you some basic results here. The world has, at least by these reported measures, has, and these countries, the 135 countries, done really quite well in terms of eliminating gender gaps in education and gender gaps in health as we measure them, okay? The way we measure the gap, if a score of 1 or 100 means no inequality, men and women have the same provision, whatever level the provision, they have the same. If you look overall in the world economy, The overall measure on economic advancement and remuneration is 0.6. That means 60% of the gap has been eliminated, 40% remains. Whereas if you look on education, more than 90% of the gap has been eliminated, 10% remains. If you look at the area of political representation, there it's less than 20% of the gap has been eliminated, 80% remains. Now you can see that if you're telling a story about how these things are all related, we got to get to that political one in order to get the other ones completely resolved, but there we are. I already mentioned that poor countries can score well or score poorly. We actually take poor country, we also divide up the sample into high-income countries, middle, and low, so you can kind of look and see if you want to hold constant income level. Sadly, and not surprisingly given last night's film, Pakistan shows up at the bottom of performance on the gender gap on an absolute level, even among low-income countries. I think it's like it's third from the bottom in low-income countries. No country has a score of 1. The very best scores in the world are the Nordic countries. That's not a surprise. And the very worst scoring countries are, sadly, countries that are poor, even though we tried to correct for that. We tried to correct for that by saying we're trying to build something that was not related to development level. A poor country should be able to strive for equity, even though they can't deliver a lot to their citizens, but it turns out that poor countries in general have much higher levels of inequity, and that just shows up in the data again and again. And then the other thing that shows up is that a influence of culture. So in the advanced country list, Saudi Arabia is at the bottom, and in the poor country list, or the Pakistan would be at the bottom. There's a heavy concentration of countries from the Islamic tradition at the bottom. That's been well documented also in World Economic Development reports, where they sort of systematically look at the opportunities for women in all kinds of advancement and make the observation that the cultural settings of these societies are really not delivering equity opportunities for women. The weakest overall performance, not surprisingly then, is in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, and the smallest gaps are in North America and Europe. So now, are there any dynamics here? I think it's actually, we've only been doing this for 5 years, so it's really too short a time. You do see, though, and we've even seen it in US congressional numbers themselves, a small but steady improvement in political representation. What does that mean? Well, maybe we started with 15% of the gap was eliminated, and now 20% of the gap is eliminated. There's a long way to go there. We looked at whether the Great Recession and the global contraction, which was a global phenomenon in 2008 and 2009, had any effect. Yeah, predictably, as you might expect, the advancement on the economic indicators slowed down. It actually peaked in 2009, went down a little bit, not a lot, in 2010 and 2011. We're very interested to see. The next report comes out in about 3 weeks, so we can all see what happens there. So the other thing I'll say about the report is we then, remember the history here, we were saying that there are 2 reasons why the World Economic Forum should do a report like this. One is because they're interested in competitiveness and efficiency. That is the argument that we got 50% of the talent pool and 50% of the consumers and 50% of the now educated population, and if you're going to be a competitive country, you have to provide opportunity for that part of the population. There's also an equity argument. For an organization that says, so the World Economic Forum says, committed to improving the state of the world. Well, the state of the world is equity and efficiency. It's values and economic performance. So we actually feel that it's very important for them to for WEF to have a gender gap. And we've then tried to look at, well, is the gender gap correlated with measures of competitiveness or measures of human values, human development? And we actually have each time now do a graph which shows actually a very strong correlation between measures of competitiveness that the World Economic Forum would be putting out and others put out, and measures of gender parity. And there's a very strong correlation between measures of gender parity or elimination of the gender gap and the now widely used, increasingly used Human Development Index, which is much more about how someone living in a society feels the value of that society. So correlation doesn't prove causality, and I know that as well as anybody else, but it's nice to see that these things are strongly correlated. So just let me give you a couple of, again, points that get back to the history. The World Economic Forum, we have discussed whether policy on quotas is an important way for countries to make progress. Some countries have quotas in political representation, others don't. We've debated this. We've actually done the measures. If you look at legislation for mandatory percentages of both genders in political assemblies, 32% of countries now have them. Of our sample of countries, 32% have mandatory percentages of both genders in political assemblies. 20% have mandatory percentage of gender in corporate boards. The World Economic Forum itself now has said to its member businesses, when you come and you can bring your 6 people, we would like one of those to be a woman. So we have our own quota in the World Economic Forum, and no more flowered bags. And I ran into Marissa Mayer. Some of you know her. She's now just taken on the CEO of Yahoo. And I ran into her at the last World Forum, and I said, so how are you enjoying it? She said, I'm really happy this year because I insisted that on all of the partners' badges, it actually says what the partner does. So it's the atmosphere at the World Economic Forum has become very sensitive to gender issues. But the quota issue is a fascinating issue because I personally grapple with this a lot in my life. I personally do not believe that I was the beneficiary of quota, but I believe again and again, and I can tell you chapter and verse every time I made a significant transition, it was because the organization inviting me to participate was looking for a qualified woman. It mattered to them, my gender mattered to them as a positive, as something they wanted to do. So in societies or in organizations which are really slow to move, a quota which then encourages you to search and develop talent might actually have an effect. I was in Europe when the Norwegian government decided to put a mandatory quota on corporate, on directors. It was a very high, 40%. People said, that's impossible. That's impossible. We'll never, ever find women to do this. Do you know what? They have found women to do that. You got to look. They're there. If you ask the question, shall I look? Do I care? You can find them. And by the way, it's created business opportunities. There are now training organizations, including one from a London Business School alum, to train women to become corporate directors because there's going to be all of these opportunities. So I actually would have to say I think the evidence on quotas effectively designed and used is fairly positive. So let me finally just end on some policy issues. I said that the whole idea behind the global gender gap is what gets measured gets done. And I said that there's a lot of visibility, and countries that don't like their ranking and care about it will often debate whether we've done it right, or did we look at the right data, or maybe the data was misreported. But it is now influencing policy because countries are looking at things like parental leave, like quotas, like differences in taxation, like differences in ownership rights of property. Because these things have been, besides the gender gap indices, which are the first part of the report, The second part of the report has country sheets, and in the country sheets you can see all the things literature would suggest are major determinants of why countries perform differently on equity. And so countries can go and see how they're doing on things like parental leave. I mentioned parental leave because the US doesn't even show up there in the sense of having paid parental leave policies, which is another reason why we end up not scoring in the top 5. But there's a lot of good policy work that's being influenced by this. And then finally, as a old-time academic, I was really happy to find that the index is now being used in research. So recently there was a paper done showing that countries where the differences in math scores on achievement tests, gender differences, are smallest, are countries where the gender gap is smallest. So maybe the gender gap, if you do well on all of these other support measures, including health, educational opportunity, the opportunity to advance, women will actually end up doing just as well as men on math and engineering tests. I thought that was pretty cool. All right, I want to end with a slightly different, because it's been so in the news lately, and it's related, and it's a little US-centric, but it is broad-based. So the US is one of the top performers in the index. As I said, it's not as high as it might be for the reasons I mentioned, but it's still quite high. The US seems to be right now quite engaged, at least at the level of the national media and book publication, on looking again at the issues of equity in opportunity in the United States. There have been a series of articles, a very high-profile article by Anne-Marie Slaughter in the Atlantic Monthly, a book called The Rise of Women and the Fall of Men. Two books got a lot of coverage recently. An interesting article by Deborah Spar responding to Anne-Marie Slaughter on work-life balance. Can we have it all? Can we not have it all? A question which we were talking about at the table is a question that is a perennial question. It's not a new question. When we look at the World Economic Forum, variables that might affect things, we actually think parental leave policy is a really important thing, so work-life balance is really important. It's fascinating reading. But I just want to give you the statistics, some statistics about the US, which I think are really interesting here. 50% of education, more than 50% now in the United States, at all levels, including tertiary degrees in many fields going to women. Large companies, regardless of their sector, are hiring women for about 50% of all entry-level positions, okay? They are hiring of college-educated entry-level workforce, 59% are women. For Smith graduates this year going into the workforce, college-educated, 59% of that entry workforce at that level, women. Okay, so that's an amazing statistic. However, 28% of women senior management, 14% executive committees and corporate boards, 4% CEOs, 16% law firm partners, 7% Hollywood directors. I had to get that one in given what happened last night. 7%, but we have Emmy Award winning. 10% aerospace engineers. There are more aerospace engineers than Hollywood directors. I don't understand that. And of course, you had the most recent number up here about Congress. Okay. Those are relative to the 59% of college-educated entry workforce. Those are low numbers. Every single one of them is low. So there's a lot of progress to be made, including in public service. I told Carol last night the only thing I don't like about this new global leadership effort is 2050 is too late. We got to get 50% of women before 2050. I understand. Okay. Now. Just to give you a few more statistics, even at the managerial level, so 40% of women now not at the senior management level, but mid-management, they're still in a major earnings differential, 73%. Even in, and this one was amazing to me, never married, childless, 22 to 30-year-olds with the same education, so Smith women in this room and Smith women who are going to graduate, they earn less than comparable men, 10 to 15% less. Now, I am going to say two things here, and the reason I think these are interesting is things for you to think about. One possibility is career choice. See, that number mixes up sector and person, sector and education, okay? It mixes it up, and women choose slightly different sectoral mixes. There are fewer investment bankers and more NGO heads. Even in the 22 to 30-year-olds, that would be true. Okay, so that's one issue that I think people should keep in mind. But then even if you go to MBAs, and I looked at these data year after year after year, you got women going into MBA programs now at about 30 to 40% of the class. You have them being hired at about that rate, but they're hired at a differential pay of about $4,600 to $5,000 at their first pay, entry pay, and then it increases over time, okay? So it's basically, pardon? Anyway, so basically, I basically want to say that I think there's a whole set. What's wonderful about this field is that there's a lot of very serious research going on to measure, document, and explain persistent differences. And there really is, at the level of the business school, at the level of the large company, at the level of committed NGOs, at the level of institutions of the Seven Sister Schools, an effort to understand and to bring down these persistent inequities in outcome. And I think that if I had to choose an area of research to go in right now, that's the area I would go in. So I think I will stop there with the view that maybe I'll stop with a list of things that over time have been suggested to me as dean of 2 business schools about why these persistent differences, even in developed countries, because remember I said even in the most developed countries, the gender gap persists, particularly in remuneration and advancement, okay, in the economic field and in politics. Those are where they persist, even in developed countries. So why? I've already mentioned sector choice. There's an amazing set of literature research that goes on among psychologists, social psychologists, and economists about differences in male and female negotiating styles for pay. Part of that, a gender gap in beginning pay at the MBA level, and its growing gap over time is because women don't negotiate to the same extent as men do for their pay. There is a difference on sector choice. Women tend, again, this is psychological research, really interesting research. Women prefer, in general, this is a normal distribution statement. They're not that there aren't women on both sides that are different. In general, prefer a less competitive environment and a more consensual environment. So that means certain kinds of career trajectories you would just choose not to do. Women are more risk averse. Here's a wonderful thing. A company is less likely to enter a liquidity event or a bankruptcy event if it has the more women on the board. That correlation has just been found by Credit Suisse. So whether you're a big company, a small company, a new company, existing company, the more women on the board, the less likely you are to go into insolvency. That's really interesting. The implicit bias argument is still very, very important. Recent Cornell studies, Sylvia Hewlett, who some of you probably know, she's done a lot of work on work-life balance. Very good work, I recommend it. But work-life balance doesn't get at the issue that sometimes it's in the perception of the employer. You can balance your life. The employer thinks you can't balance your life. So there's been actually some really good work showing that in an experimental setting that a CV which says you're a mother or about to be a mother, you're less likely to be chosen for an interview, or you're less likely to be given an advancement. The employer's thinking, you can't balance it. And I know that, and I'm not going to give you the opportunity to balance it. So that seems to me that's a very good form of implicit bias that we've got to deal with. There is the issue of one's own expectations. So I can go back to my Fred Leonard story or my story at MIT and say every time I didn't think I could do it. I had a mentor or a sponsor. It's an important difference. A mentor gives you advice. A sponsor actually, they're tied to your success. They take personal gratification in your success. And so having sponsors is really important, and the more women in organizations, the more possibility for women to find a sponsor. And then the last issue, of course, is just good old overt discrimination. And I don't want to leave that off the list. These are all reasons why, even in advanced industrial societies that have invested a lot in the education of women and taken away a lot of the barriers and put in place a lot of legal support, you still have these persistent differences in outcomes. So let's work to get the inequities eliminated. I like the 50 by 2050, but let's all know that we're trying to get that done a lot faster. And let's thank Smith College and its brilliant leadership for helping our society achieve that outcome. Okay.